Hi guys, welcome to the next bit of research methods. We're going to look at observations today. But before we do, I had a weird experience earlier. There was a guy walking past the front garden, and he tried to sell me a coffin. And I said, that's the last thing I need. There you go. So there are a few different types of observations that we're going to look at. And what you need to do for task 4.1 is to just do a bit of a brief description in the relevant boxes on the Word document of each of the types. Now, the first kind of distinction we need to make is between participant observation and non-participant observation. The main thing that we're going to be talking about is participant observation. And this is where the researcher actually gets involved in the group with which they're studying. So they actually become a member and get involved in the day-to-day life of that particular group. For example, researchers have spent time kind of living with and being a part of street gangs or drug dealers and things like that. Then the flip side of that is non-participant observation. Now that's a bit more straightforward. It's just a case of kind of watching, observing behaviour to try and make conclusions. So, for example, you could have children playing in the park, and it sounds a bit creepy, but they're watching them to note down behaviours and make conclusions from that. They're not getting involved with what's happening with that group. They're just watching. Now, on top of that, you've got the difference between what's called overt observation and covert. So you might get an overt participant observation or a covert participant observation. You might get an overt non-participant observation and a covert non-participant observation. And basically the difference, overt means like open. So what's going on there is that the people being researched know exactly who the researcher is. They know what they're doing there. There's no deception or anything like that. Whereas covert means like hidden or undercover. And so think like covert ops, like the military would conduct covert ops. It'd be like secret missions. So covert participant observation is when the people being observed don't know that there's an actual researcher there. So often the researcher will have to take on a false identity and pose as a genuine member of the group. So it might be that they pretend to be a genuine gang member, which obviously has lots of potential issues with it. But those are the four kind of main types that we're going to be talking about. As always, we'll look at the strengths and weaknesses, and that's going to be continuing the task 3.1. So we'll look at that now. Okay, so the next part of the Word document that I want you to fill out is the example. So there's a slide looking at a researcher who took on a covert participant role with a gang of teenagers in Glasgow in the late 60s. So I want you to make notes on that, and the important thing is some of the to do with the method and the issues around participant observation in that kind of situation. So continuing task 3.1 is making notes on the example. And then you need to think about three kind of stages of participant observation and add those to the Word document as well. They're commonly called getting in, staying in, and getting out. They're kind of the stages that you have to go through in order to conduct participant observation, whether it's overt or covert, and there's things that you need to know about each stage. So with getting in, it's practically very difficult, can be very difficult. Particularly if you're thinking, some groups might be more difficult than others. If there's a criminal element involved, that obviously is very difficult to get involved with because there's people who naturally don't want to have strangers sneaking around, asking questions, finding out information. There was one researcher, a guy called Venkatesh, who studied a gang in Chicago, and they held him for 24 hours when he first started asking questions because they thought he was from a rival gang. And they basically said, what you're doing, this is the wrong way to go about it, and invited him to come and live with them. So getting in can be a matter of luck. Same with James Patrick, which is the example that you're going to look at or have looked at already. He was basically invited by a student that he taught to go and hang out with this gang and see what it's all about, which is what he did. So in order to, practically speaking, it's very, very difficult potentially to get in. It might be that your age or your gender or your ethnicity become a factor. So it's going to be, certain characteristics will need to be met for you to be able to fit into that gang, to be a participant in that gang. You've got to be able to kind of meet those criteria. So James Patrick, the guy, he was a particularly young-looking teacher. He was 23 at the time, but he looked very young, so he could pass for 17, and therefore he could kind of plausibly be a participant, be part of this gang, and got away with it. But the only reason he could get in because he was invited by this one guy. It was a kind of lucky coincidence almost. Sometimes it could be very hard to find that opening. You might need certain relationships or have to make certain relationships, particularly if it's covert. If it's overt, you can try and ask for access, to be able to let in, and that's going to be difficult in itself. But covert, actually posing as one of the members, could be very hard to get into. So issues there. Staying in as well can be challenging. But one of the difficulties is being so involved in the group. Because you're a participant, because you get involved in the day-to-day life, you could get so involved that you actually lose your objectivity and become biased. You lose sight of what you're there to do as a researcher, to kind of, you want to be involved so you get the full understanding of the thoughts and feelings that these groups have and go through, so that you can get the most valid research. But you can actually kind of identify with them too much and become part of the group rather than being an observer, particularly if it's covert. If it's covert participant observation, you kind of maintaining this double life. It's like you're undercover agent type of thing, and you can lose sight of who you really are. And that's called going native. There's a phrase called going native, which means you've lost that objectivity. You've become biased. You've lost sight of what you're doing and been too identified with the group, too involved in what the group's doing. So there's some issues with staying in as well. When you're staying in as well, you've got to make sure you get an appropriate role within the group, one that gives you good access and good place to kind of view everything, but one where you're not getting too involved in everything and going native. Particularly when there's things like criminal elements. So the guy I talked about before, Venkatesh, he actually was involved in some of the violence that the gang carried out. So you've got to be obviously really careful about how you conduct this research, and once you're staying in, you've got to find the right role within the organisation, the group, to be able to carry out your job without losing sight of who you are or doing things that are incredibly unethical. And then you've got getting out, which is, practically speaking, it can be easier. You can simply leave. So James Patrick, he basically just got so shocked and horrified by the violence that he was witnessing, and he had instances of being threatened himself. So he basically just couldn't take it anymore and left. Just fully retreated. So practically speaking, that's not as difficult as getting in, but there's still issues. You've got to be able to kind of detach yourself from that setting and that environment, and to be able to give an impartial account, and that makes it valid. And if you've gone native, it can be very difficult to adjust back and give an impartial account. There's quite a few researchers that have reported issues of adjusting back to normal life after experiences in participant observation. And also there could be serious reprisals. If you've investigated a criminal gang, you could easily be afraid of repercussions of reprisals, of violence against you, threats against you. You would need to be very careful about what you publish, whether you can publish everything to do with like if you've witnessed crimes, you might be putting your participants in harm's way. So there's lots of ethical issues with participant observation, and that's something that's got to be carefully thought about of every stage of the getting in, the staying in, and the getting out. But particularly when you're writing up and publishing what your work, your research, you've got to think about that. Okay, so make notes. Task 3.1, make notes on getting in, staying in, getting out. Put that all in the relevant section of the Word document. Okay, we're going to look at the strengths and weaknesses of observations now. We're going to start with focusing on participant observation, because the majority of the time when we're talking about observations, we're actually talking about participant observation. And you can see on the Word document that I've split that into overt and covert first, so we'll deal specifically with those types of participant observation, because the strengths and weaknesses often go hand in hand and kind of pair up, and that's useful for when you're writing an essay. And then I'll go into kind of more general strengths and weaknesses of participant observation that applies to both overt and covert. So let's start with overt. One of the strengths is the big strength is it avoids the serious ethical issues that covert does. So there's no lying to people, no pretending to be somebody you're not. You can get informed consent. So big positives on the ethics front. And so in a weakness of covert, you can put in the other column, and when you're writing in an essay, you can write a paragraph, you talk about the strength of one side and the weakness of the other side. A weakness of covert is that it's massively unethical a lot of the time. When you have to lie to people about who you are and what you're there for, when you can't get that informed consent, it's unethical. A weakness of overt, though, a weakness of the one way everyone knows that you're the researcher, is that because they know you're a researcher, because they know that you're watching them specifically, you're observing them, they might well behave very differently. Okay, so they might, something that you need to know about is called the Hawthorne effect. And the Hawthorne effect is this idea that when we're being watched, we change our behavior. We don't behave in the natural way that we would. And so that's problematic because we don't get valid results. Okay, it's a validity issue. So a serious problem with the overt participant observation is that you don't have that same validity because people might change how they act. They don't act in the way they naturally would because they know they're being watched. So on the flip side, a big strength, this is the one of the strongest reasons why people would pick covert participant observation. Strength is that people are going to behave naturally because they don't know that you're a researcher. They don't know they're being watched. You're just one of the group. So those strengths and weaknesses, that strength and weakness there goes hand in hand. If it's covert, it's more valid, but there's more ethical issues. And if it's overt, then there's less ethical issues, but it's less valid. And you've got to work out in your own mind which one would be better. And you can make the argument for both. Another positive of overt is that because they know you're a researcher, you can ask questions you wouldn't if you were undercover. So if there was something you didn't understand, something you wanted to more, what's called naive questions, stuff that is obvious to the group but isn't obvious to a researcher, you can ask those kind of questions. James Patrick, the guy who the example we've looked at, he had to basically stay quiet the first couple of nights because he was still trying to work out what their slang words meant. Which would have been obvious to someone who was properly part of the group. So there's a positive there. Another positive is that you can openly take notes. Okay, when they know you're the researcher, they won't have a problem with you sitting in on there and scribbling stuff down to help you remember. Whereas a weakness then of covert is you can't take notes because you've got to maintain this persona, this identity. So James Patrick, again the example we looked at, he had to write it all down from memory after his experiences. Which question, you might misremember, you might not get everything, you might only remember certain events, the ones that kind of most stood out to you, and so you're not necessarily getting a full, valid and accurate picture. So there's a weakness there of covert and a strength of overt. Another weakness with covert on the ethical side is that you may have to participate in unethical or even illegal activities. So people who've been involved and researched gangs and drugs and things like that have been actively involved, sometimes in drug dealing, sometimes in violence, in situations like that. So you've got some serious ethical issues there, which you have to kind of do in order to maintain your cover. If they weren't getting involved in those activities, they're not being a participant, the people would have known something was up and they wouldn't have been able to continue the research. So it might have been a necessary evil, but one of the guys was actively involved in beating up a guy who had assaulted his girlfriend. So there's serious ethical issues there, and that often could be one of the issues as a cost for the researcher, that they have to kind of live with that kind of being exposed to that kind of activity all the time, but B, taking part in it potentially as well. So serious issues involved in participant observation. Now, if we go on to the kind of more general strengths and weaknesses for both covert and overt participant observation, there's a few things. Theoretically, it's something that interpretivists are strongly for. The reason being, the whole point of it is to put yourself in the shoes of those people, to see through their eyes, to understand the meanings that they have, and that, for interpretivists, is the important thing to understand within society. And it's arguably the best way to do it. More than an interview or a questionnaire, it's the best way to get that verstehen, that understanding of the meanings of what's going on in people's heads. So interpretivists are all for, whether it's overt or covert, all for participant observation. On the flip side, then, we've got positivists who are going to say, they don't like it, don't value it. Reason being that you can't quantify the data. Okay, you can't then prove hypotheses. You can't prove cause and effect. So it's not given us, the real thing that the positivists are after. It's also quite subjective. So positivists would argue it's subjective. It's one person's interpretation of what's going on. So that makes it subjective, and it also means that it's difficult to replicate and unreliable. One person might go in and draw these conclusions. Another person, it's very difficult to replicate because of the nature of the situation. But B, if they could go in and replicate, they might come away with a very different understanding, a different conclusion from what the first researcher did. So positivists are against it because it's you can't quantify the data. It's subjective and it's unreliable. Practically speaking, a strength is that it may well be the only method available to research particular things. For example, criminal networks, criminal gangs. They're unlikely to volunteer to do interviews or agree to do interviews or answer a questionnaire. So it may well be in some situations, the only research method. So practically speaking, that's a strength. But weaknesses, we talked about kind of the practical issues of getting in. Can be very difficult, can be very costly sometimes, and very time consuming. You're talking about someone potentially living with a group for an extended period of time, months, even years. They have a mortgage to pay, they need to be funded, and so it can be very, very costly and unpractical and time consuming. While they're doing that, they can't be doing their job for the university as a sociology lecturer. So issues practically there. Theoretically as well, there's a problem with both covert and overt participant observation because it's not a very big sample. We're talking about these groups. Generally, these groups are quite small, which means that they're not necessarily representative of all of society. It's not something we can necessarily generalize to the wider society. Having said that, the groups that are often studied, they might well be representative for those types of groups. For example, gangs or cults or whatever it happens to be. So there's a flip side to that, but one of the problems is that it's not representative. So lots of strengths and weaknesses there. Task 4.1, you need to fill out the table in the appropriate place on the Word document. So I've tried to lay it out as simply as possible, following what I've said. And once you've done that, we're going to look at non-participant observation and the strengths and weaknesses of that. Okay, so we've covered participant observation specifically, but we also need to look at non-participant observation. Now, most of the time, when we talk about observations, it's likely that it's going to be in the context of participant observation, but you need to be aware of non-participant observation too, and it is a tool that's used by sociologists to gather data. The key thing with it, with non-participant observation, obviously you're not getting involved, you're just a kind of passive, distant observer. Often they won't know that you're being watched, so if they're in public, there can be lots of observations done ethically, that's fine. If they're in public, they expect to be seen by other people, and you can be doing research like that. Often it's best when the people being observed, the participants, don't know that they're being observed because of covert non-participant observation. Because, and this is the key reason why it's done really, is because it gets rid of the Hawthorne effect, okay? with participant observation, for when you get involved with the research, particularly when it's overt participant observation, they know they're being watched. Okay, the group know they're being watched, and therefore they might not behave in the same way. If you think about how you behave when you're in the classroom and you know the teacher's watching, compared to when you're in the classroom or when you're at home or whatever, when you're somewhere else and you feel comfortable and natural and you're not being watched. When you know you're being watched, you change your behavior. So the key thing with non-participant observation is it avoids that kind of Hawthorne effect, that lessening of validity, where people would change their actions, but without the ethical issues of covert participant observation. So the one way around it is basically lie to people and pretend you're one of the gang, one of the group. The other way around it is doing non-participant observation, and you get rid of that kind of issue of validity, so it could arguably be more valid than participant observation. But problem with that is that a problem with non-participant observation, big problem, is that you don't really get to see the world through these guys' eyes. You don't get to see the world as if you're in their shoes. You don't get the full experience of the meanings and understandings that you would in participant observation. So the absolute core of why interpretativists do research and what they're looking for, you miss out on with non-participant observation, because you can't get involved, you can't ask questions, you can't be part of it and understand what it's like. So it's an issue there. As well as that, observers might have their own interpretations, and that might be subjective, so it could lack validity. But generally speaking, it's a stronger way of avoiding the Hawthorne effect in terms of ethics. So it's a lot more ethical, because there's no face-to-face deception, there's no lying, and there's no risk as well of having to do unethical things to maintain your cover. So that's the key reason why people would use non-participant observation. So on the Word document, find the appropriate bit on the table there and fill that in, strengths and weaknesses of non-participant observation. Okay, task 4.2 now then. So we've learned all about observations, participant and non-participant, overt and covert. It's going to be not very easy for you to actually conduct an observation like you've done with the questionnaires and interviews, and we need to keep our exam technique going. So I'm going to set you an exam question, which is going to appear on the screen now. So the question goes like this. It goes, read item C below and answer the question that follows. Item C says, structured interviews are a relatively cheap way of studying a sample. Positivist sociologists favour structured interviews because they produce reliable data that can be used to test hypotheses. However, critics argue that structured interviews are inflexible and that their results lack validity. Applying material from item C and your knowledge, evaluate the advantages of using structured interviews in sociological research. 20 marks. Okay, now a couple of things with a question like this. A research methods question, 20-mark essay. So it's an essay, so it's introduction, 4 paragraphs for 20 marks, 4 Peely paragraphs, and a conclusion. Now the question specifically gives you in the item a couple of advantages of structured interviews, and the question is evaluate advantages. So you want to be talking about advantages. So each paragraph really should start with an advantage. So paragraph 1 would be one of the advantages from item C. Now if you read through item C, I'm going to help you out here. So when I'm decoding this, positivist sociologists favour structured interviews because they produce reliable data. Okay, so it's reliable. That would be one paragraph that you could start talking about. And then your next paragraph could be that it can be used to test hypotheses. Okay, so there's 2 paragraphs already there. You can then use your own knowledge to come up with at least one more, ideally 2. And the way that you'd write it is you'd take the advantage, take the issue, explain how it all works, try and give an example, if you can, of research that has used structured interviews, and I think we looked at some already, so you should be able to do that. And then you evaluate it with a disadvantage. So if you're talking about, it being reliable, and the positivists like that, you can use, like the example, like the item says, you can use the interpretivist point of view, and the fact that they're inflexible means you get less validity. That can be a criticism, and you can develop that criticism quite well. Now, what you've got to be careful about doing is not writing a strengths paragraph or strengths essay for one half of it, and then another half that's completely a weaknesses essay. You've got to try and link them together. So you've got to think carefully about which weakness fits which strength the best, and kind of answers and counters. Remember, I talked about them pairing up before, the strengths and weaknesses. Well, this is where this comes into play. So you write your strength paragraph, your Peely paragraph, make your point, give your explanation, go into plenty of depth, explaining how it all works, why it's an advantage. Give an example, if you can, of specific research. Link it back to the question, the idea that it is a useful advantage of a structured interview. And then you get this criticism, this it might be interpretivist point of view, it might be whatever it happens to be, but the best fitting criticism, and develop that a little bit. Explain why it's a problem and why it links to the strength that you've given. Okay, so if I've said, for example, it can be used to test hypotheses, that's very much a positivist point of view. That's how they understand society. So my strongest criticism there is going to be saying that interpretivists don't value that quantitative data that proves hypotheses. They value the qualitative data that gets at the heart of the meaning of what people have, because that's the important bit of society, because society is a bottom-up, socially constructed thing. Which is opposite to what the positivists say. So that'd be the most direct criticism, and you can develop it like that. Try and get 4 Peely paragraphs. Try and evaluate in each one. Try and do 4 different advantages then, if you can. If you can't do that, do 3 advantages, and then what you can do is do the opposite. So do 1 disadvantage and criticize that with a strength. Okay, if that makes any sense, if you're following my train of thought, try and keep up. So 4 paragraphs. Introduction to start off with, what is the method? Just explain your description of the method. What is a structured interview? How's it different from an unstructured interview maybe? And then conclusion, overall, is it a strong, good method for sociologists to use? Or is there a better one? Or is it not very good because the weaknesses outweigh the strengths? Okay. Have a go at that. I'm not expecting you to write it out in full necessarily. You can just do it as a kind of bullet pointed plan almost. So have a go at that, and then email me through your answer. Okay, see you next time.